The hiss of the gaslight was the only warning before you stepped off the freezing, soot-stained cobblestones and into the suffocating heat of an 1800s English saloon. The smell hit you immediately. A thick, unyielding wall of cheap tobacco smoke, spilled gin, wet wool, and the desperate sweat of the working class. In Victorian Britain, a saloon wasn't some rugged frontier outpost. It was a highly specific, heavily guarded illusion of luxury engineered within the sprawling, grimy cities of the empire. As the Industrial Revolution chewed people up and spat them out, cunning landlords realized a brilliant, predatory truth. The poorest citizens would pay a premium just to feel human for an hour. To exploit this, they ruthlessly divided their public houses. They left the bare floorboards and the freezing drafts for the public bar, but they built the saloon bar as a glittering, irresistible trap. They stuffed these rooms with plush velvet benches, roaring hearths, intricately etched, mirrors that made the cramped spaces feel like palaces, and polished mahogany counters that gleamed under the newly installed gas lamps. This was a calculated psychological escape. For men whose lungs were black from the coal mines and whose hands were shredded by textile looms, the saloon was the only real living room they had ever known. It was a chaotic, deafening theatre where they could fiercely debate politics, gamble away their meagre wages on illicit rat-pitching contests in the back alleys, and drown their bone-deep exhaustion in heavy, dark porter. But the most shocking reality of these spaces, the thing that sent Victorian moralists and the upper classes into an absolute pearl-clutching frenzy, was the heavy presence of women. The English saloon was absolutely not a boys' club. Women, broken by back-breaking domestic service or the relentless, dangerous grind of factory life, packed into these glittering rooms, shoulder to shoulder with the men. For them, it was a vital social lifeline, a rare place to escape freezing, overcrowded tenements and the constant, gnawing anxiety of poverty. They pooled their pennies for glasses of sweetened gin, finding a rapid, blinding warmth that made the damp chill of the city temporarily vanish. The noise inside was constant, a roaring blend of raucous laughter, bitter arguments, the clinking of cheap glass, and a hired pianist hammering out bawdy tunes in the corner to keep the energy frantic and the drinks flowing. To the aristocracy, these saloons were dens of absolute iniquity and moral collapse. But to the people inside, they were sanctuaries. They were the only places in a brutally unequal society where a starving worker could sit on a padded seat, look at their reflection in a gilded mirror, and pretend, just for a moment, that they weren't being ground into dust by the very city they built. But beneath the etched glass and the polished mahogany lay a stomach-turning reality that the gaslight carefully obscured. The glittering illusion of the Victorian saloon was, in truth, a petri dish of disease, functioning as a lethal trap for the very working-class women and men who sought refuge there. The hygiene standards of the 1800s were virtually non-existent, and in these packed, sweltering rooms, the air itself was a biological hazard. Tuberculosis and cholera stalked the crowded velvet benches. Men continuously spat chewing tobacco onto the sawdust-covered floors, while tarnished brass spittoons overflowed, creating a festering breeding ground for bacteria that clung relentlessly to the trailing hemlines of the women's heavy wool dresses. Behind the massive bar, the reality of the service was even grimmer. Glasses were absolutely never washed with soap or boiling water. Instead, a wildly overworked barmaid would simply plunge a used, saliva-coated glass into a single, stagnant bucket of cold, brown water kept hidden beneath the counter. Give it a careless wipe with a filthy rag, and immediately hand it to the next patron. But the true, horrifying poison wasn't merely on the rim of the glass, it was swirling inside it. To ruthlessly maximize their profits, cunning landlords heavily adulterated their alcohol. The cheap, sweetened gin that the working women relied upon to numb their aching bodies was rarely pure spirits. It was routinely and dangerously cut with industrial turpentine, drops of sulfuric acid, and alum to give it a violent, artificial burning kick, while the cheap porter beer was laced with excessive salt to force an unnatural, unquenchable thirst. This horrific chemical cocktail induced a rapid, aggressive intoxication, leading to devastating physical addiction that ravaged working-class neighborhoods. Women, already pushed to the absolute brink by crushing poverty and relentless domestic labor, found themselves trapped in a vicious cycle of chemical dependency, their bodies slowly failing from the toxic, unregulated concoctions. If the drinks were deadly, the food provided was a desperate gamble. These saloons served only what could be preserved in cheap vinegar or aggressively salted to drive up alcohol sales. The meager staple diet consisted of cold, boiled trotters, rubbery pickled eggs floating in cloudy jars, and heavily salted pork scratchings. For a few hard-earned pennies, hungry patrons could buy a dense, greasy meat pie from a roaming street vendor. These infamous penny pies were notoriously suspect, filled with unrecognizable scraps of mystery meat, gristle, or even discarded horseflesh, scavenged from the city's overflowing slaughterhouses. The men and women ate them in the dim light, washing down the rancid taste with their acid-laced gin, entirely oblivious to the fact that their beloved sanctuary was actively poisoning them. As the clock steadily ticked toward midnight, the initial warmth and lively chatter of the saloon would inevitably curdle into a volatile, dangerous energy. As the hands of the ornate saloon clock crept past 11, the atmosphere inside fundamentally shifted from a rowdy escape into a powder keg of raw, unhinged survival. The laughter curdled into something desperate and jagged. The sheer volume of toxic, adulterated gin had done its work, stripping away the thin veneer of Victorian civility and unleashing the bone-deep exhaustion and rage of the working poor. This was the witching hour of the English saloon, where the nightly highlights were rarely glamorous and almost always brutal. Arguments over a game of dominoes or a misheard neighborhood slight would explode into sudden, terrifying violence. Men, fueled by blinding chemical intoxication, would hurl heavy glass tankards across the room, shattering the expensive etched mirrors landlords so proudly displayed. But the women, far from being passive bystanders shrinking into the velvet corners, were deeply entangled in this midnight chaos. Many of the most infamous, vicious brawls recorded in Victorian police ledgers were fought by women, battling over stolen wages, neighborhood betrayals, or the desperate defense of their own battered dignity. They fought tooth and nail in their heavy wool skirts, slipping on the beer-soaked sawdust, while the hired chucker-out, the brutal 19th century equivalent of a bouncer, waded into the melee with swinging truncheons to protect the landlord's property. The noise was apocalyptic. The shrieks of patrons, the splintering of mahogany chairs, and the frantic, pounding chords of the pianist, desperately trying to play over the riot. Outside, the newly formed Metropolitan Police, armed with wooden batons and rattling bullseye lanterns, would often wait by the swinging doors, perfectly content to let the working class batter themselves senseless before dragging the bloodied survivors off to a freezing, lice-infested jail cell. The true tragedy, however, wasn't just the physical violence, it was the chilling aftermath that bled out into the surrounding community. When the gaslights were finally choked off and the landlords forcefully barred the doors, the patrons were thrust back out into the freezing, rain-slicked cobblestones. the temporary illusion of wealth and warmth was gone, replaced by the crushing realization that their meager weekly wages had been entirely swallowed by the till. Women, heavily intoxicated and deeply vulnerable, had to navigate the pitch-black predatory alleyways back to their starving children and freezing tenements. Husbands and wives, both poisoned by the landlord's acid-laced concoctions, dragged their furious resentments home, turning cramped single-room slums into violent battlegrounds. The saloon, which had promised a glittering, warm sanctuary from the horrors of the Industrial Revolution, was actually its most effective weapon. It systematically drained the pockets of the poorest neighborhoods, destroyed their health with toxic chemicals, and fractured families under the weight of sheer, desperate addiction. The 1800s English saloon wasn't a romanticized gathering place. It was a beautiful, gilded cage where the most vulnerable citizens paid for the privilege of their own destruction, one poisoned glass at a time.